We all receive information through our senses. This is how we interact with the physical world around us. But what happens when the input of information is higher than what you can actually process? You are now dealing with overstimulation, also known as sensory overload. And unfortunately, this is a very real scenario for a lot of people on the autism spectrum. So today we are talking about sensory overload, also known as overstimulation in autism. But before we can actually do that, we kind of need to take a step back and take a look at what actually happens in our brain when we process information. Everyone has to process stimuli. Like I said, that is how we interact with the outside world. The biggest part of this are our eyes, which help us see, our ears for hearing, our tongue for taste, as well as feeling, the skin for feeling, our nose for smelling. Basically, our senses give us information that we can then choose to act on. All of our senses are connected to our brain through nerves. The brain is basically the spot that collects all of that information and then tries to process it so we can actually use that information. Every second, our brain receives 11 million stimuli, which is basically bits per second. It's very warm today, so if I'm a little bit shiny and very pink, you know why. This little human being doesn't really cope well with a sense of heat. Goodness. So the first gate, as you could call it, where the stimuli enter is our thalamus, which is a part of our brain. You could see this as the regulator that kind of decides which stimuli you should consciously notice and which you don't really need to become aware of. And of those 11 million stimuli that get into our brain every second, our brain can only consciously process about 0.001% of that. So that's 100 bits per second. Also, if you want to know more of like the research behind this, get a little bit deeper, I'll make sure to have a blog post link in which I also have all of the research that I used for this video linked, so you can check that out for yourself. So shortly, that is how our brain works. Now, for autism, as you might be aware, a lot of autistic people tend to be more sensitive to different stimuli. Some also are less sensitive, but I would say in general, we tend to be a little bit more sensitive to different stimuli. Our brain lets through more to our conscious mind, which means that from those 11 million stimuli that we get into our brain tends to let through more to our conscious mind, which means that those 100 bits are just simply full faster. Because just like any neurotypical person, we can only actually process 100 bits per second, 100 stimuli per second, which still, if you think about it, is quite a lot. So to make it a little bit more visual, you could compare this to a sink and a drain. So all of the information that comes in, those 11 million stimuli per second, are basically the water that flows through your sink. The water that is in your pipes is basically the stimuli that come into your brain every second, those 11 million bits per second. If you turn on your sink, that is the stimuli that actually come through to your conscious mind. This is what is fed to your conscious mind, the stimuli that you are trying to process. The drain of your sink is what you can actually process. This is what you can comfortably process without it really taking too much of a toll on your body or your mind. So the pipes that hold the water, those are all of the stimuli coming into your body. The sink, how open or closed it is what comes into your conscious mind. So what your thalamus lets through to your conscious mind, and then the drain is what you can actually process, the water you can actually process. Normally 100 drops, 100 bits per second would be let through that sink. Your drain can handle this and everything just runs smoothly. Usually your sink is not open far enough to actually fill it up too far, so there's no problem there. Everything goes smoothly, everything is okay. In case of autism, usually the sink is opened up a little bit farther, your tap is opened up a little bit farther, so more stimuli are coming through to your conscious mind. and the water runs into the sink more quickly. It fills up faster. Then if someone has to deal with specific stimuli that they are more sensitive to, because usually in autism you have specific stimuli that tend to be a bit more sensitive to. For me, for example, it's scent. I'm very sensitive to scents. I'm also very sensitive to sounds. So those are stimuli that kind of tend to get into my sink, into my basin a little bit more. The tap is opened a little bit further. Now, when you have to deal with those stimuli, the thing is, your drain can no longer handle that as easily. You are now receiving more than those 100 drops per second, more than those 100 bits per second, and your body is trying to figure out how to deal with it, which it cannot. It doesn't have enough processing power to actually get rid of all of that water. The drain is not big enough to allow everything to go through smoothly, and it kind of builds up. Now the container that's holding the water basically just overflows. The drain can no longer let enough through, the water is building up, it overflows. You are now dealing with overstimulation, sensory overload, which tend to result in a meltdown. Not very fun, I can speak from experience, unfortunately. Research has actually shown that usually women suffer more, but are also able to enjoy different stimuli more than men usually are on the spectrum, which is kind of interesting. Kind of would like to dive a little bit deeper into that. Alright, so now you have an idea of what overstimulation actually is. So what we haven't talked about yet is how expectations can actually have a pretty big impact on how our brain basically works, on how the information gets into our brain and what gets to our conscious mind. I think this is actually a pretty big part of why people on the autism spectrum tend to be a bit more sensitive to sensory overload than neurotypical people would be. So the brain works a lot based on expectations. So everything that you expect in a certain situation, like trees in a forest, that information doesn't really get into your conscious mind. You know it's there, you see what you expect basically. You don't consciously notice all of those trees in that forest because it's just a forest. What you will notice, however, is, for example, a fence that is placed in the middle of that forest. You are not expecting to see a fence in that forest, so this is information that your brain actually feels like is useful for you to actually notice consciously. It comes through to your conscious mind. Makes sense, right? Basically, this just ensures that you are able to react to that deviation of what your expectations were. This helps to keep you safe, it helps to keep you alive. And basically our brain is constantly forming those expectations and kind of comparing what is coming into those expectations to decide what needs to be coming to your conscious mind and what does not. This is also kind of the reason that you maybe sometimes don't really see clutter anymore when you're getting used to it, when it's there for longer, because your brain kind of places that clutter now into the expected picture. So it doesn't really get into your conscious mind, which is something completely different that we can talk about in a different time, in a different video. What this also does is it basically means that your brain has to spend less energy on constantly processing all of the pictures that it's seeing, because it already has that expectation. If the reality matches up to that expectation, basically that takes less energy than when it basically has to build that entire picture up from the ground, which I guess also makes sense, right? So this way your brain conserves some energy in processing the stimuli. In autism, that filter tends to be a bit more sensitive, and in some cases less sensitive, but we are talking about the more sensitive in this video. So in this case, you are now not only noticing the larger deviations like that fence in the middle of the forest, no, you are also noticing all of the separate trees that are in the forest that usually just fit in the picture of a forest. You are seeing trees. You may notice that the shape of trees is different. You may notice that the bark looks a little bit different, or the leaves. You may notice that some moss is growing on that one tree and not on that other tree. So you're noticing more details, which can be a very good thing, but it also means that you get to process more stimuli by seeing those details. So your brain is now spending more energy, more of those 100 bits per second that it can spend on processing stimuli, on all of those details, on placing all of that information and using that, categorizing that. So a really nice quote, I think, is, "We see leaves and branches where you see a tree. We see trees where you see a forest." This is by Ernst Stuurman. So something else that I quickly want to touch on is that we basically have two ways of getting stimuli into our brain. First is through our senses, which is what we've been talking about so far, but also our thoughts are basically a form of stimuli to our brain. So senses, external stimuli, but also then the thoughts, which are an internal stimuli. With this also comes our posture, so being aware of our posture, also a form of external stimulus. Our balance, which also is something that we need to constantly process in order to actually stay upright. And then, like I said, thoughts and feelings. So this basically means that there are two ways to get overstimulated. You can get overstimulated by external stimuli, so things you notice through your senses. And then you can also actually get overstimulated by internal stimuli. So noticing things about your posture, but usually thoughts. Usually that's where the overstimulation comes in, where the sensory overload comes in. Though I'm not entirely sure if you can actually call it sensory overload when it's caused by your thoughts. So maybe that's just overstimulation. Maybe we can dive a little bit deeper into that as well in a different video. But that aside, overstimulation basically is a very intense form of stress for the body. The stress actually is so strong that your body tends to recognize it as danger. Your limbic system now comes into action, and that leads to you going into survival mode. So when you're going into survival mode, your normal thinking is basically blocked. You are not able to process your thoughts rationally anymore. You are only able to act primarily. So fight, fly, or freeze. Those are basically the things that happen to you when you get into overstimulation, into sensory overloads. You are getting so much information in your brain that you can no longer process, which means that the stress is going up, and now basically your body takes over because your conscious mind is no longer able to handle it. So your body takes over and it's going to try and get away from that stress. So you're getting into the fight, fly, or freeze mode. In the case of overstimulation, this often translates in people getting a meltdown, which pretty much is just you getting into the fight, fly, or freeze mode. We tend to recognize that as a meltdown in autism, which again we could go into a little bit deeper in another video. For now, I think it's good to know that usually that translates into tantrums, which I think is more common in kids than in adults, but definitely not uncommon in adults. Crying spells, which I think are very common in both kids and adults, and also very common just completely turning inward and really not reacting to the outside world. Usually a meltdown is followed up by very intense exhaustion. Your body has basically used up all of the energy to try and survive, and now it's just shut down. You are so drained and exhausted. Fortunately, I speak from experience. I'm not sure how to explain it, but basically you just want to lay in bed and sleep. There's no energy for anything else. For some people, other physical complaints can definitely also come with that meltdown. Very common are really bad headaches after a meltdown. And during a situation of a meltdown, of overstimulation, sensory overload, it is really hard to stay aware and actually think rationally rather than just go with that instinctual reaction that your body's trying to push on you. It takes a lot of energy and a lot of effort to actually get out of that fight, flight, and freeze mode and start to think rationally again and to actually react to your surroundings in a rational way when you are in that state. Alright, so that was a pretty dense video, I feel like, when it comes to information. I hope you're not completely overstimulated by just watching this video now. Let's just a quick look at what sensory overload is, what overstimulation is in autism. It's good to know that this is not exclusive to autism. Anyone can experience this. It's just a lot more common in people on the autism spectrum. If you have any questions about this, please let me know. If you want to share your experience, please let me know, because that is super valuable, I feel like. If you think that this video might be helpful for someone you know, feel free to share it with them, which actually also really helps me out. Give this video a thumbs up if this was helpful for you in any way, shape or form. And with that said, I wish you a lovely rest of your day, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!